Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. It's the start of a whole new week, and I hope you're ready for 5 great stories to get your week started just right. Today's topic of discussion will be strange religions and the people that are a part of them. So today, let's begin with a story about a man who considers himself just an average Joe, a normal writer, who may be the god of his own universe. Let's begin by hearing whispers.
I am a murderer. I'm responsible for the deaths of 75 within 2 weeks. I've stabbed men to death, rendered bodies to ash, killed children in the womb, and even drowned whole ships at sea. I've changed the fate of kingdoms and seen to it that uncharted planets remained unfound. I would likely be the most prolific serial killer in the United States, if not for one problem. The police claim that if murdering fictional characters was a crime, they'd have to jail Stephen King and George R. for multiple life sentences. They say this as they laugh me out of the police station. They think it's a joke, or that maybe I'm not right in my head. But I can assure you, I'm as right as I've ever been. I listened to them tell their stories for years, and I've heard them scream when I end their lives. I'm a murderer, pure and simple, and their blood is on my hands. You're probably reading this, though, and thinking that I'm ready for the rubber room. Let me start from the beginning. I've always been a creative mind. When I was younger, I could hear them whisper to me about their homes, their verdant green kingdoms, their sterile, majestic spaceships, the feel of rolling decks beneath their feet, and so much more. It manifested in my games, and my school friends would always gather around to see what today's adventure would be. We traveled the cosmos, fought wars between elves and men, and roamed imaginary prairies as we hunted wrongdoers on horseback. As I grew older, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and their stories became my stories. I wrote about the kingdoms of my youth, the adventures of my childhood, and by the time I was 20, I had 5 books published, even one on the New York Times bestseller list. As I grew, so grew my fame. My writing was prolific, and all the while the voices told me their stories. I took my readers to fantastic places, and their patronage allowed me to live quite well. By the time I was 30, I had a home and a family and enough published work to fill a bookshelf. That's when the problems started. It all started with Aberdeen Price, dashing archaeologist adventure. He told me of his next adventure, a trip to the city of Bone. However, I was working on something else at the time, and didn't want to divert efforts away from my current project. So I wrote some notes and promised myself I would sit down and give him some time when I was done. This apparently wasn't good enough for Aberdeen. He came every night in my dreams and told me his story over and over and over again, until finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I stopped what I was doing and diverted all my attention to writing his next book. It was a hit, a bestseller, and the biggest mistake of my life. You see, this showed the voices that they could get what they wanted by badgering me. Every night from that night on, they would come to me and tell me their stories, each overlapping the other, until I just couldn't take it anymore. The kingdom of Verdant Green was once at the mercy of the dark wizard Zormuth. His evil armies threatened to... Scanners once more alert Kevin Gorel that he is nearing his destination. The dark planet Zephyr rises from the darkness of space as he see the island of Katmandil off the starboard side of Elizabeth's Folly. The shore is quiet, but Captain Cree can once again see the natives amongst the trees as he hears his quarry. The elusive Dr. Burton will strike again this night, and I will be ready to... Their voices towered in my mind like the screams of children as they tried to make themselves heard. That was my first mental breakdown, and my worst. My wife arrived home in time to save me from bleeding to death. They put me in an institution for 3 weeks after that. Lisa thought it was all the strain of my busy writing schedule. The strain of writing so much must have just become too much for you, she said. as she stood by my bedside and looked down with pity for her poor, brilliant husband. She had no idea. The worst part wasn't the IVs or the sedatives, the shitty TV, or the staying in a room for 24 hours a day, the sounds of sorrow from down the hall, even the constant itching from the healing cuts on my arms. It was the week and a half I spent with my hands in restraints. Without my hands, I couldn't write. Without writing, there was no way to stop the shrieking harpies in my brain from driving me insane. It took me a while to convince them that writing was a kind of therapy for me. The battle was made all the harder by my wife's constant arguments about how the writing had put me here in the first place. After a week and a half of no change, they had begun to see that I might be making some sense. I began to write again, and the changes were noticeable. I started sleeping, became less hostile, finished my meals, and a month later I was ready to go home. The voices started ramping up again almost immediately. By this point in my career, I had 7 stories running on and off. That's a lot of voices trying to be heard. I tried to keep up with them, but I could feel my sanity slipping again as they screamed for my attention day and night. By my second week home, my wife was ready to have me committed all over again. I'd stop sleeping and would lock myself in my study for days to make the voices stop for even a few minutes. That was when my first murder took place. That's not to say that no one had ever died in my stories. Characters die in stories. That's the nature of storytelling. But this was the first time I'd ever deviated from the path set forward by the voices. Detective Sam Umbridge was coming to the climactic end of his latest crime novel, and the shootout with the killer was becoming heated. I had meant to write that Dario West, the antagonist of the novel, was struck by Sam's bullet as he leaned around the doorframe. Before I knew what I'd done, though, I had written the death of beloved gumshoe Sam Umbridge instead. I had moved on to the next sentence before I caught my error, but it was too late by then. He died in my head with a gut-wrenching scream, and just like that, his voice was mercifully silent. For a moment, all the voices were silent. It was as though they had all seen what I had done in my manic state. I cleaned up the draft a little bit before sending it off. Sam and Dario had killed each other in the shootout, and Sam had died victorious. Fans hated that Detective Sam Umbridge would never make another appearance on their shelves, but they accepted it. The end was widely praised by fans and critics alike, an all-around success. My agent even called to congratulate me on the climax of a much-beloved series, and asked if everything was going all right with me. Last time we talked, you sounded as though you were a little shell-shocked. I guess I wasn't shocked now that I think of it. The process really made me think. Why not kill what was driving me crazy? I didn't have to kill them all, just enough of them to make the voices quiet down a little. Like any prolific serial killer will tell you, it's hard to stop once you've started. Before I quite realized what I'd done, I'd ended them all. I ended my 8-book fantasy series with the death of the entire court and the eventual fall of the protagonist in his order. I watched as Kelvern Gorel flew his ship and crew into the phantom night, where certain doom awaited, and he would never be heard from again. After sinking the ship of his arch-rival, I had the Spanish Armada sink Elizabeth's Folly with all hands aboard, while Captain Cree floated atop the waves after taking a sword to the belly. I dropped a tomb on the head of Aberdeen Price, the one who had started my descent, and made the ruins he was exploring his own tomb in turn. I killed them all, one by one, and the fans were livid. How could you just kill them? Why wouldn't you simply end the series on a high note? Why did they all have to die? I toyed with the idea of ending their series, but I knew that it wouldn't work the moment I thought of it. They were never my stories in the end. They were only my stories to tell. If I left them alive, they would always want one more adventure. Killing them was all I could do to stop my descent into madness. And as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt myself smile at the thought of my long-awaited sleep. It never came. I've been staring at my sleeping wife for the past 7 hours as I keep court with the whispering dead. Their spirits are unwilling to die, the part of my soul I put inside them reluctant to be put to rest. It's only now that I see the folly of my actions. The dead, you see, are not to be satiated with adventures or the continuing joy of existence. They moan, they wail, They bemoan the lives and the loves that were taken from them. At first, it was only for me that I wept. Now I see that this curse won't end with me. You see, I was watching my daughter as she played in the park yesterday. She played in the sandbox, her dolls and her brother's action figures out on an adventure of her own creation. I watched her going about her games of make-believe as I sat in a daze. When I asked her about it over lunch, she told me a story about knights and castles, people hunting for dragons, and brave warriors protecting those in need from harm. It was a story just like the ones I had made up as a kid. The kingdom was similar to the one I had left in ashes. I beg you, anyone out there who hears the whispers, don't pass the gift to others. It must end with us, and never darken the mind again. I must keep my own vigil now. I must watch my own daughter now, before the madness takes hold. I can't let the whispers have her too, even if it means the death of another of my creations. I won't let the madness have her.
Funny how creativity can sometimes make you the center of your own universe. Let's move on to the story of someone traveling the United States, trying to get home after a long time away. Someone who finds another traveler on the road that may have their own story to tell. Let's hear a story about the hitchhiker.
I could have flown home, but I thought a drive would clear my head. I'd just finished 4 years in the Marines, 4 of the messiest years of my life. I'd made the mistake of bringing my new wife to California with me, and returned from Iraq to find her warming someone else's bed. The bed in question was of a fellow Marine, someone left on base while I fought and bled for my country. 6 months of staying on base so I could meet with lawyers and finish my divorce, and I was officially out and done. When I told my dad I was going to rent a car and drive home, he understood. I told him I needed to come back slow so I could clear my mind, and he told me to drive safe. "Take your time, kid. We'll be here when you get back," he said, and I took him up on it. I was coming across the country, California to Tennessee, and I was seeing the sights and taking in the local flavor. I had decided to make this a long overdue vacation. I did a lot of things on that trip, but my only mistake was picking the kid up. I was driving through Oklahoma, enjoying the sights and feeling like I could watch the hills and valleys roll by forever, when I saw the kid standing there with his thumb out. He was young, couldn't have been old enough to enlist, despite his army coat. It was July, the heat stifling, but he was wearing fatigues and a service jacket that looked antique. The breeze ruffled his hair, pushing it back in a harsh puff that made me think of kids blowing on dandelion fluff. Maybe it was the jacket, or maybe it was the look of naked want on his face, but I pulled up beside him and rolled the window down. "Hey kid, you need a lift?" He turned his perfect sky blue eyes on me, and I'll never forget his words. Sometimes I hear them in my sleep. "I sure do. Can you give me a lift to McMahon, mister? God'll thank you if you do." I thought that was a little weird, but I told him to climb in, and he did so gladly. The signs told me that McCann was about 30 miles up the road, and I expected the kid to chatter like a squirrel the whole way. To my surprise, he was quiet, his eyes closed, and his head bowed for a couple of minutes. It took me a second to realize he was praying, and when he finished, he sat up and plastered a half-daffy grin on his face. "God tell you I'm a straight shooter?" I asked, more to break the ice than anything. "He said thank you for your assistance, mister, and you'll be greatly rewarded in his kingdom." I nodded, thinking I could use all the help I could get. The farther we drove, the more I began to suspect that something was off about the kid. He stared forward the whole way, his eyes on the horizon, his mouth seemed set in an eternal grin. He wasn't as young as I'd thought, maybe 18 or 19, and the jacket said his name was Harris, had it stenciled right there over the left breast. It was covered in patches, too, the kind you get for service, and I was glancing at one over his right pocket when I saw the bulge under the coat. I felt a cold shudder run through me as I recognized it. The kid was packing. You look a little young for the service, kid, I said, trying to dissuade some of my fear. Your brother give you that jacket? Was he in Iraq like me? My dad left it to me when he died, the kid said matter-of-factly. Sorry to hear that. Was he in Iraq? Gulf War, he said, his voice not matching the grin. He enlisted before it started and was there a couple of years after it ended. I bet he had some stories, I said with a nod. I had been about to start in on one of my sandbox tales, but the kid cut me off suddenly with the last thing I expected. You believe in God, mister? I blinked, the subject unexpected. Not really, kid. I'm an atheist. Have been since after what happened to me overseas. I think that if there is a God, it's a pretty crummy thing for him to do, to let us live here like this. I'd expected a fight, but the kid just nodded. He forgives you for that. Daddy was like you, Mama said, before he went to war. He saw something over there, bad things, and he came back from the war looking for God. He said he had seen some things over there that scared him, made him want to be better, and he couldn't do better without some help. So he came back and started looking for a purpose, and he found one. He found a lot of people offering purpose, but only one who delivered. By the time I was born, he was part of the family. I listened politely, not wanting to interrupt the kid, but the way he was talking about his dad's search for God made me a little concerned. It didn't seem like a happy memory. I was born into the family. Father Marcus was our everything, our teacher, our preacher, our second father, our salvation. He brought a lot of people together, lots of lost people, but that wasn't enough. Father Marcus wanted more. He had plans, big plans, but they wouldn't turn out to be so good for us. He was quiet for a minute, looking out the glass and seeming lost in thought. I thought again that he had to be a kid, couldn't be out of high school, but maybe it was just whatever was wrong with him. Even though his eyes looked like he was in the worst pain imaginable, he still wore that plastered-on grin, the one that never reached those eyes. He was like a doll with a troubled owner, a doll that smiles through its destruction. When I was 10, Father Marcus told the congregation that the end was coming. He told them that the government was going to come down and take everything that we had built here, and that the devil was set against us, and we needed to escape. He told everybody to sell their things, bring just the bare minimum, and come to a place that he had found. It was a farm on the outskirts of town, a big farm that had once been a dairy. They gave him their money so that he could secure their paradise, free from anything that the government or the devil or anybody else might do, and came there to start their new lives. We were hopeful that this would be our paradise, but it wasn't a paradise. In the end, it was a prison. I felt a chill run up my spine as he said that. I wanted to tell him to stop. I didn't want to hear the end of it, but instead I just listened. The kid was hurting. That was clear enough, but his story was so captivating. It was like one of those true crime stories, the ones so bad that you just know it has to be true. I kept my eyes on the road and listened, just letting him tell it, already knowing that it wouldn't have a happy ending. We were basically his slaves. We worked in the fields. We took care of the animals. We kept the big house where he lived and did his bidding. Father Marcus came down to spit the hellfire every night and to pass down new edicts and rules. Men were not permitted in the big house. No one but Father Marcus could lay with a woman, even within a marriage. All children were Father Marcus's children, but his actual children were special. Eventually, he took all the women that he liked up to the house to populate the earth. He took my sister up there with him, and we never saw her again. People didn't like it much, but what could they do? Father Marcus was keeping us safe from the apocalypse, right? So we followed his orders till everything fell apart. We rolled into the outskirts of McMahon then, the farms and barns making me think of the place the kid was talking about. I wondered suddenly where we were going, why the kid wanted to go to McMahon so bad. Every mile felt like an eternal march, and I was dreading coming to the end of the journey. Where, I started, but the kid seemed to be expecting the question. Stay on the main road, mister, he said, clearing his throat before going on. He seemed as dry as an old stick, and when I reached behind the seat and offered him a Coke from the cooler, he took it with a smile. I wondered why I'd done that. I didn't want the kid to go on, but in a way I did. I needed the end of it. I needed to know how it had all shook out. I was a curious bastard, it seemed, and I needed to see the bodies in this kid's path. Then one day he gathered us in the barn and told us that the end was near. He told us we needed to prepare ourselves to go because we were meeting God tonight. He gave us all something to drink, something in a red cup that his wives dipped out, and we all drank it. No one argued. No one fought him. We were all so brainwashed that we would have jumped in front of the 6:15 train that ran near the farm if he'd asked. Everyone drank. Everyone obeyed. Everyone went to sleep. They stayed asleep, too, except for me. I woke up in the hospital with tubes in my arm and my wrists secured to the bed. The police were there, one of them waiting in the room with me, and they had questions. Turned out that they were the ones who had been coming, not God. They had arrived to find everyone dead, falling around the barn like dolls, but had managed to get there in time to save me. I don't know why I lived while everyone else died, and it ate at me for a long time. Father Marcus, my family, everyone was gone, and I'd been left behind. No one wanted anything to do with me. My dad had burned a lot of bridges before we went into the family, and none of them wanted to take in a moody 16-year-old who'd just been through hell. So I went into the system, going from group home to group home, till a couple of weeks ago. I clutched the wheel hard, suddenly very worried about what we might find in McMahon. The town was coming up now, a nice old brick town that looked downright picturesque. We passed a sign for a new megachurch, the Sunrise Gospel House, and there was a smiling old man beaming down from the front. The kid shot a glare at him and patted his heart, inevitably patting the piece as well. I suddenly wondered who was in McMahon that this kid needed to see. I was watching TV in the group home, and an ad came on for a church. The church had recently acquired its own network, and the pastor of the church was very familiar. He spoke about peace and God's love, but all I could hear was the voice that told us to drink the juice and go meet God. As I watched him smiling and hugging people, I heard a very different voice in the back of my mind. It was God, the real God, and he told me what I had to do. He said I needed to be his sword, and I needed to cleave the unrighteous from his midst. He patted the gun again, whispering a prayer to God, and my hair stood up on the back of my neck as something strong and strange wafted from the kid. In that moment, he felt very righteous. We were well into town now, rolling up Main Street, and he told me to stop. I dropped the kid off at the light, and he thanked me, said he could make it from here. He gave me a real smile then, not the dopey one he'd been wearing the whole way through as he told his sad little tale, and waved at me. God bless you, mister. I'm off to do his work. Then he was gone, and I sat there watching him until someone politely honked behind me, and I was forced to roll along. I wasn't sure what to do as I made my way out of town. Did I tell somebody? If this pastor had really messed the kid up like that, then maybe he had it coming. Was that really my call to make, though? In the end, I called the McMahon Police Department and told them what I suspected. I told them about the kid and the story that he had spilled, but I don't think they took me seriously. The dispatcher made it sound like it was going into a little pile of crackpot shit, but I felt I had done my due diligence. I was still thinking about it when I stopped for the night, wondering where the kid was and what he was doing as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up the next day and turned on the news to see that Pastor Michael Wheeler of the Sunrise Gospel House had been shot in front of his congregation. The pastor, someone wanted by the FBI for his alleged connections to several past cults, had been shot by someone from one of his past religious orders. The kid was in custody, but the police were saying he was mentally unwell, and this was likely a retaliation slang. Police were still looking for a mysterious caller who had tipped them off before the shooting, and they had many questions for that individual. I left Oklahoma as quickly as I could, flinching every time I saw a cop. That was a couple of years ago, and I've never told anybody what happened on that trip home. It's something that's weighed on me since I left that kid on Main Street, and I can only imagine that he was right about God blessing me. I came back, found a job that paid well, met the love of my life, and settled into wedded bliss fairly easily. It all seemed very easy while it was happening, and I can't help but wonder if a little divine direction had anything to do with it. As long as he doesn't point me at his enemies like he did that kid, I suppose we can be square.
It's always interesting, the things you can learn from a man on the road. Moving on, let's hear a story about a priest who's made a strange and terrible discovery about the God of his particular universe. Let's hear a story about a different sort of ritual, one that begins with the phrase, "If I make this shot, the world will survive."
It's something I'd heard my whole life, though it's never been this clear. If I make this shot, the world lives. As a kid, it would rustle across my brain like a flock of birds. Sometimes if I was thinking hard about something, and sometimes when I was just being quiet and trying to focus. It was never distracting, never something that tore me away from my day-to-day life, and in fact, it made me feel safe. It wasn't even in my voice, not any voice I was familiar with. They say that when you talk to yourself, and your internal voice talks back to you, it's still your voice. This voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. My whole life, it sounded like the same childish trill. As I got older and started going to church, I started to think it might be something different. I noticed that the voice always came before something good, giving me the confidence to try things I wouldn't normally do. I'd hear the voice just before a test, or right before I stepped up to bat, and I'd know that everything was about to turn out great. The more it happened, the more I became convinced that I was special. The longer it went on, the more I thought I was hearing the voice of God. I told my priest about it, my family being very Catholic, and he said it sounded like I had a close relationship with God. Even at 8 years old, I could tell that he didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I knew what I was hearing, and I knew it was important. The more it pushed me towards success, the more I started saying it to myself like a mantra. I'd say, "If I make this shot, the world will live," just before I went on stage for a debate. I'd say, "If I make this shot, the world will live," just before I took a test. I'd say, "If I make this shot, the world will live," just before I hit a ball, or threw a basketball, or did anything I wanted to succeed at. And if I heard the voice say it back, then I'd know that I was about to do great things. It's what pushed me into the priesthood, and pushed me to my ultimate act of blasphemy. That's not the right word, but it's the best I can think of. It had been 30 years since I'd first heard that voice, and I was now a young priest with a church of my own. I had built a reputation with the other priests for writing sermons that kept parishioners in their seats, and having a lot of luck regarding matters with the diocese. I'd gotten through the ranks faster than most, doing very well on my tests of catechism and church doctrine. At this rate, I was on my way to becoming one of the youngest bishops in my area. I'd never told any of them about the voices, thinking it was similar to the way people in the Bible had heard the voice of God once upon a time. I knew it wasn't okay for me to think of myself as a prophet, but whatever the reason, I was still certain that it was the voice of God. I should have been pleased, but I found myself thinking more and more about the nature of the phrase. I'd hear it before sermons sometimes, and know that today's reflection on the Lord's words would be particularly captivating. I still said it to myself before doing anything, and I realized that it'd become kind of a lucky charm to me. Things would go well, and I would attribute it to the mantra. But why did I make this leap? Because it had always been? I needed to be sure. So I started doing research. Luckily, or unluckily, the Catholic Church has a lot of resources for those looking to research the nature of religion. There was a lot of information on prophets, others who had communicated with God and his messengers, but my own situation was unique. I heard the same phrase again and again, and if it was the voice of God, then it was the first for such repetition. God told his prophets and chosen mouthpieces what he wanted them to do. Go to Nineveh, free the Hebrews, sacrifice your son. Whatever he was asking people to do, he was always very specific. If I make this shot, the world will live was not particularly specific, though. I don't want any of you reading this to think that I went in only from a position of faith. I started by having a checkup with Dr. Redmond, my family physician. He ran a series of tests to determine if I had any underlying conditions, perhaps a tumor or some undiagnosed schizophrenia. It would have been easier if it was just something I could chalk up to external stimuli, but Dr. Redmond told me I was healthy as a horse when the results came back. EKG, EEG, X-ray, physical, CT scan, heck, you even passed the cardiac battery with flying colors. I hope the Vatican has deep pockets, because I'd imagine you just broke your healthcare budget for the year. I thanked him, figuring the church could foot the bill for my upcoming research. With the tests showing that I was in the right state of mind with a sound body, I started studying ways to instigate a more receptive state. There were several accounts of priests fasting and praying so they could speak with God, and while the idea of starving myself didn't appeal to me, it seemed to be the best way to find out more about the voice. It had never changed through the years, still sounding youngish with the first rumblings of depth, and I wanted to know if the phrase had some deeper meaning. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but if he had some job for me, I needed to disseminate what it was. I told my aides what I meant to do, giving them special instructions not to bother me, but to check on me periodically. If they found me passed out or unconscious, they had specific instructions to offer aid. If I was hurting myself, worse than depriving myself of sleep and food, I meant, they were to call the hospital and have me admitted. As long as I was still praying or meditating or not doing myself any harm, they would leave me to it. I planned to conduct my little experiment from Sunday night to Saturday night of the following week, and on the following Sunday, I would come to Mass with something to talk about for my weekly sermon. I had no idea how prophetic that statement would be. So, after Mass on Sunday night, I locked myself in my study, ate my last meal for the week, and began to read. I started at the beginning, reading of creation and of the garden, and as the hours stretched on, I began to read aloud to keep myself awake. The first night was easily the hardest. My body cried out for sleep as my stomach grumbled for lack of food. By the time Brother Joseph had come to check on me the next morning, I was past the worst of it and still reciting the book of Numbers. He left me water, asking me how I felt before leaving me to it. This was the height of my excitement for the project. I'd only been awake for about a day, and my zeal was still running high. I had heard the words 3 or 4 times throughout the night, and they had been clearer than they had ever been before. Sometimes the words were muffled, sounding like a kid's tin can phone, but that night the words were crisp and clear. I read for the rest of the day, hearing them 2 more times, and as night settled in, I felt tired, but still with hope and God's love. By day 3, some of my enthusiasm was starting to slip. I'd heard the words a few more times, twice perhaps, but I was starting to feel the effects of sleep deprivation. My stomach was also in a knot, and my head was swimming as my blood sugar fluctuated wildly. I had read stories about men fasting for weeks at a time, and I couldn't imagine another day of this. The only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that, the few times I'd heard it, the voice had been clear as a bell. Thursday night found me doing laps in my study when I finally got my answer. I had finished the Bible Wednesday night, and had moved on to the Contemplations of Dogma by Cardinal Mansfield. I had thought about praying, but it was tempting to sleep if I wasn't walking. I had been awake for 4 days now, and my desire to rest was almost as invasive as my desire to eat. I was dizzy as I read, the words running together, and as a stomach cramp hit me, I saw the book tumble from my hands as I doubled over. I thought I might throw up the water I had drunk a few hours ago, but instead I continued forward and fell to the floor. I landed next to the book, my world going black as I fell over, and I wasn't sure if I was going to wake up. If I make this shot, the world lives. I could hear the voice as if someone were whispering it into my ear. I opened my eyes and was suddenly aware of floating. I was hovering over the shoulder of a young giant, his face that of a high school or college student. He was writing an essay, his pencil scratching on the page as he toiled away at his work. He would stop and erase something before starting again, and as I moved closer, I could see that he had a small stack of finished papers beside him on the desk. How long he'd been writing on this essay was anyone's guess, but with an angry growl, I watched him crumble up the page before turning in his chair to face me. If I make this shot, the world lives. With a smooth and practiced arc, I watched him toss the paper into a nearby garbage pail before returning to his work, his pencil scratching away as he wrote. I was speechless. What was I seeing here? Was this God? It couldn't be. Could it? As he furrowed his brow, I saw that this essay wasn't the only thing on his desk. There was a manuscript, too, the title page proclaiming it to be Golden Fields. I began to understand why I had heard him say the mantra so many times. I assumed it was part of his process, and the throwing away of ideas was as much a part of it as writing itself. If I were to read that manuscript, I wondered, would I find a priest in it? Perhaps one who hears voices? Was this man my creator? My God? The architect of everything that I knew and loved? I came to in the emergency room, Brother Marcus having found me seizing on the floor and called an ambulance. Now I lie here, contemplating what I saw. Was it real? Did I actually see these things? Did I actually see this being, or was it something my mind created? As I sit here, I can still hear the words from time to time, but I don't say them anymore. The church has given me a short leave of absence, but I don't know if I can ever go back to my old life. How can I preach of God and glory while I know in my heart that we exist because of a single being and his ability to throw a paper ball into a hoop? It makes me realize how insubstantial we are, how little we matter. But that's not the worst thing that has occurred to me while I lay here. As I sit and listen to the listless beeps of the machine, I find my mind circling back to the same question again and again. If he should miss his next shot, what would happen? Would we ever know? If he missed his next shot, would we continue to live, or simply snuff out into non-existence?
Catholicism is always full of rituals, so I guess what's one more, right? Moving right along, we have a tale about a man who discovers an odd religion, something he thought he knew the depths of, but may in fact be out of his depth. So, let's learn a little about the depths of faith.
I'm sitting at my computer, soaking wet in the clothes I've been wearing all evening. I want to get this all down while I can still remember it perfectly. I say that like I'll ever be able to forget it. I was raised Baptist. I've lived in the Deep South for most of my life, and it was normal to be religious, even zealously so. I went to the usual activities: Bible vacation school, church camp, church 3 nights a week, sermons on Sundays, and until I went to college, I was pretty much a regular churchgoer. Once I left for college, kind of getting out of that environment, I kind of fell off, though. Suddenly, passing classes was a little more important than keeping up with my spiritual health. Suddenly, parties and dating were more important than my relationship with God. So I blinked one day and realized it had been almost 15 years since I'd been to church, and I thought I might like to experience it again. A quick Google search showed me a church in my area that wasn't too far out of town and seemed like it'd be a good fit for me. I saw from their community Facebook page that they were having an event on Saturday. Just a meet and greet for new members, bring a covered dish for the potluck, with a spiritual event to follow where new members could get baptized and join the church. I didn't have anything going on Saturday, so I thought that sounded pretty good. I made a macaroni casserole, one of the few things I actually knew how to make, and on Saturday, I sat at about 3 p.m. in my best church clothes. As I pulled up outside the church, I was worried that I might be a little underdressed in my button-up and work slacks. People were going in, men in suits, crisp white shirts, ladies in long dresses, and kids in the sort of Sunday school clothes I was used to seeing at different churches. Made me think there might be a dress code. I was new, though, and I figured that if I wasn't within that dress code, they'd let me know. So I took my dish and headed for the fellowship hall that was set off beside the church. I walked in the side door to a very familiar scene. The welcome was immediate and warm. A woman came to take my dish to the table as the pastor came to introduce himself as Pastor Marshall. I had expected a firm handshake and, to be left alone to mingle, but the pastor took me to each of the little groups there and introduced me to his congregation. I met his deacons, their families, the aldermen and their wives, the treasurer, the underpastors, and about 24 other families. I was escorted to the food table by some of the deacons and told which dishes were the best and which ones were best avoided. Miss Liz is a good woman, but there's quite a few eggshells in her dressing. And which had been made by eligible ladies of the church. Miss Conroy's daughter's about your age and makes a great pecan pie. I was spirited away to a table where I was bombarded with questions and anecdotes and given the usual church gossip. It was honestly a little like being home again. The church I'd belonged to in my childhood was very tight-knit, and as the kids ran around and the adults talked and laughed quietly, I felt a sense of homecoming wash over me. As the food was eaten and the plates were thrown away, we all moved into the worship hall for service. I sat on the front row with the 4 or 5 other new faces, and as Pastor Marshall mounted the pulpit, I couldn't help but smile. I felt a warmth in me, and I was already thinking about how I would have to change my schedule so I could come on Sundays and Wednesdays. As he laid out a sermon on acceptance and forgiveness, I began to reflect on my life here. It's hard not to when you've found somewhere you intend to stay for a while. In my mind, I would find fulfillment in the church, just like I had as a kid. I'd meet a nice girl, raise a family, grow old within the community where they would support me and my little ones. I know it sounds a little silly, but we all know the places that our mind goes during times like this. I see we have some new faces on the front bench tonight. Would any of you like to join our church and get baptized tonight? I stood up like a coal had been lit under me. I felt moved in a way that I never had to go to the altar, to renew my vows to God, and be washed clean in the baptismal font. The pastor smiled as he waved me up, and I had to stop myself from sprinting up the stairs. I was excited. I was in such a hurry to be part of this. I had no idea what I was in for. The pastor had me recite the affirmation, the renewal of my promise to God, and when he turned to indicate the space behind the pulpit, I realized they had an indoor baptismal pool. I'd never seen one of those before, We always did our baptisms in a nearby creek, but as he took my hand and led me towards it, I realized he meant to baptize me fully clothed. I fished the things out of my pocket that I didn't want to get wet, my phone, my keys, my wallet, etc., and set them on the stairs before stepping into the slightly warm water. I wouldn't normally have agreed to let my clothes get wet. I don't like being in wet clothes as a rule, but I was operating in a daze, and when he knelt to dip me, I felt my knees bending as I went down as well. I baptize you in the name of the Father, His Son, and the Holy Spirit. Good luck. I opened my mouth to ask why I would need luck, but as he dipped me back, my mouth was filled with water, and I was enveloped in the warm embrace of the pool. It didn't have the acrid smell of chlorine like I had thought it would. It was salty, actually, and that took me by surprise. I lay on my back beneath the water, waiting to be pulled back up, and when I opened my eyes, I realized that the hand was gone, and I was alone in the depths of the pool. The pool was suddenly deeper than I remembered it. The surface glimmered miles above me. The bottom was a shadowy depth beneath me, and I was floating in the depths like a diver. I started to panic, thinking I would drown, but the longer I sat beneath, the less I was worried. I was floating in the placid space, hovering in the placental moment, and I felt utterly at peace with the world and everything within it. I didn't notice that something was getting closer to me until it was almost too late. It began as a chill in the water, something that chased away the warmth of that pool. I opened an eye, looking to the far side, and saw a shadow rising from the distance. It was small at first, a black cloud that grew as it floated closer, but it grew wider as it came towards me. It was, I don't know, it was like something you see from the depths when you're still in the part of the water where the light can reach you. It was something I was afraid would take hold of me and drag me into the murk where I would be lost. Whatever it was, it filled me with a dread that I had never known before. As it continued to draw closer, I thought it might be a whale. I had thought at first that it might be a bank of darkness, but as it grew closer, I could see that the blackness was just how it looked. It seemed to exist inside its own fog of murk, and what I could see wasn't terribly pleasant. Its skin was gray, pebbly like a stony shore, and it appeared scaled or maybe ridged. Its eyes were huge, and the closer it got, the smaller I felt. It was massive, beyond the description of size or dimensions, and the closer it got, the less I wanted to be the focus of that attention. This must be what an ant felt like as it stood on a finger of a human, what an insect felt like before the frog devours it, and I could feel my whole body vibrating under the strain of its continued existence. It seemed to lean closer as it came up before me, our bodies inches from each other, and when it spoke, I could feel it in my bones. "Welcome back, my child." It reached out a massive finger, the print on the end looking like the indicators on a map. Even the end of that finger was bigger than my whole body, and it was like someone reaching out with a building to touch me. I closed my eyes, feeling it would obliterate me with that massive digit. But when it came into contact with my forehead, I was enveloped in a blinding light that burned me to a cinder. I came up gasping and thrashing from the depths, the pastor catching me as the congregation cheered. As their applause rose to envelop me, I looked down at the pool, expecting to see myself floating or standing on the edge of a lip, but the whole baptismal font was only about 2 feet deep. Standing up, I could see the water wasn't even over my knees. The pastor looked up, still bent and kneeling at the bottom of the pool, and his expression was resplendent. Did he know what would happen? Did anything happen while I was floating in that abyss? The longer I stared at him, the longer I came to believe that he had known what would happen, and his eyes seemed to be trying to calm me as he stood and embraced me as a brother. As he did, I heard him whisper into my ear to be easy. Steady on, son, steady on. It's a little jarring at first, but it's all over now. Rejoice in the light, and be well. When I looked at him again, I could see a deeper understanding in his eyes, something I didn't know how I had missed before. When I looked out across the congregation, it was a look I saw mirrored in them as well. I was speechless, unsure of what to do, and when he led me out of the pool, it was all I could do not to break into a run. He offered me a towel, letting me stand shivering beside the pool as he asked the others if they wanted to come up. When the second man approached, seeming more hesitant than I had been, I grabbed my things and snuck out the choir entrance that led to the fellowship hall. It was empty now, the whole space covered in semi-shadow, and within that shadow, I could feel the regard of whatever had spoken to me in the depths. The next thing I knew, I was in my car and driving too fast from him. It was a miracle that I didn't get pulled over, though I briefly wondered who I had to thank for that. As I sit here now, my shaking has nothing to do with the cold. If this was the God of my father, the God I've been praying to all my life, then I think I'd rather be an atheist. Even as I sit here now, I can still imagine floating in that void as the ancient creature regards me kindly, its mind brushing against my own, and the dread threatening to overtake me again. I'd pray for oblivion, but I know what's waiting there for me now.
One more story for you, and I promise I've saved a pretty good one for last. It's an old classic about a man whose therapist makes him the focus of a brand new religion. So let's hear a little bit about becoming a captive god.
You'll have to bear with me while I tell you my story. So much of it is written from the hazy recollections of someone who was in captivity. Don't misunderstand. I wasn't abused in the traditional sense. I was well kept, I was well fed, and I really wanted for nothing except my freedom. It all started one day when I visited a new therapist. Dr. McAllister had been recommended by a friend of mine. He said he was very good, and he'd helped him get through a lot of issues that he had with his mother and discover some things about his sexuality. He put you under and put you in touch with your real self, and that was how he overcame a lot of your issues. It all sounded great to me. I'd been having trouble sleeping and was looking for some way to get the sleep I needed to function. My insomnia would sometimes last for days, and it was starting to affect my life. So, I made an appointment, and 2 weeks later I was lying on his couch, listening to Dr. McAllister count down from 10 as he put me in a suggestive trance. It was very sudden, like blinking, but everything changed after that trance. When I came out just as suddenly, Dr. McAllister looked strange, and I asked if something had happened. Strange may not be descriptive enough. He looked somehow enraptured, enlightened, utterly worshipful. You spoke to me about things you couldn't possibly have known. You talked to me about my childhood. You helped me get over the death of my mother. You helped me more in this hour-long session than I've ever helped anyone. I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but when he gripped my hand, his eyes shone like the lights of a zealot. I need more. Please let me put you back under, so I can discover more. I pulled away from him and took a huge step back. What the hell was he talking about? I had come here for help, but Suddenly he wanted me to help him. I had to get out of here. I had to leave now. McAllister tried to stop me, but I was out the door before he could say much more than stop. I didn't sleep well that night either. It was becoming a real problem. Sometimes I would lay in bed and swear I heard whispers, but I put it off as auditory hallucinations. I hadn't slept well in the past 3 weeks, and I knew it was something that would catch up to me eventually. When I would force myself out of the house for work or to run errands, I could swear I felt someone watching me. What's more, I could swear I'd catch glimpses of someone from the corner of my eye, but they would always be gone when I turned to look at them. It never happened in my house, always when I was out and about, and the paranoia on top of the sleep deprivation was slowly eroding my sanity. So, when I heard someone open a window in my living room one night, I rolled over and just thought it was me having paranoid hallucinations. Turned out, it hadn't been a hallucination. When I heard someone open my bedroom door, I rolled over and found Dr. McAllister standing there watching me. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well either, and his eyes looked crazed as we stood staring at each other. I wasn't sure if he was real or not, but when he lunged at me, I curled into a ball and cried out for him to stop. He didn't attack me, though. He didn't hurt me at all. Though now, I wish he'd killed me right there. Instead, he just slipped a needle into my arm, and I watched his thumb push down the plunger as I felt a wave of warm and inviting sleep roll through me. I woke up in a finished basement, the lights turned down low, strapped to a chair as Dr. McAllister made sure my bindings were comfortable. I struggled, my limbs heavy and uncoordinated, but he held up a fresh needle and told me if I didn't calm down, he was going to put me out again. I made myself as still as I could, not sure what to expect here. This didn't seem to be a sexual thing. I was fully dressed, and the way he was tending to me almost felt worshipful. I didn't want it to come to this, but I can't live without the knowledge you possess. I know you don't believe what I'm saying, but while you were unconscious, you told me about things that may very well change my life. You spoke to me of things that opened my eyes, ideas I had never even conceived of, and the longer I went without hearing your voice again, the more I felt my newfound security crumbling. I'm sorry, I'm not usually like this, but I had to possess you, to have your knowledge, to understand your words. I can promise you that while you remain with me, you'll want for nothing. You are to me as a captured god that I wish to understand. We talked a lot that night, though I mostly yelled at him to let me go. In the end, though, he just injected me with something to knock me out, and I drifted off into a peaceful unconsciousness. And that was how I became Dr. McAllister's captive god. I will say that while I was with him, I never wanted for restful sleep. This was due in part to the fact that I spent most of my time in a near catatonic state. Dr. McAllister kept me restrained in a large underground area that I always thought of as the basement. I was seated in a large, comfortable chair, my hands secured to the arms with soft straps. There was a remote at hand, and I was allowed to watch anything I wanted on television, as long as the doctor was away. If I was hungry, all I had to do was push a button, and a short blonde woman, who I would later discover was the doctor's wife, would bring me anything I wanted. In the beginning, it really wasn't so bad. I was kept in a sluggish state from the drugs he used on me to induce the state that he wanted, but it wasn't bad. I watched TV, I ate, I existed. Given that I had worked 40-plus hours a week and lived off crappy food for most of my adult life, I felt almost like I was being pampered. I was free to relax. I could do almost anything, except leave or talk to people who were likely to wonder what had happened to me. My mom, my dad, my friends. I wondered if any of them wondered what had happened to me. It may seem odd to you that I never tried to escape, but my head was always in a cloud of some sort. The drugs left me just lucid enough to consume TV or audiobooks, but I never felt able to really settle my thoughts on anything in particular. I knew I should want to escape, but it was always a hard concept to catch hold of. Those days were the good days, back when Dr. McAllister was still operating his practice. That was when he was still pretending to have a normal life. He would come down in the evenings to talk with me, just telling me his problems and asking me to help. He would ask me about stocks or bonds, the housing market, business ideas, patents, inventions, and I would try my best to direct him in the way he wanted. I wasn't really sure what he wanted. My head was too foggy most of the time to make sense of it, but I would try my best to help him without the need to be placed in an unconscious state. We'd talk for hours about everything from the state of his marriage, the depraved childhood he had lived through, the future of psychology, and even the condition of his soul. I didn't always want to hear what he had to say, but I understood that it didn't really matter what I wanted. It didn't seem to make much of a difference anyway. We would talk for hours, but the end result was always a needle in my arm or my neck and several hours of blissful unconsciousness. I remember little from these periods of blackout, fortunately, but sometimes I would go to a dark place and just hang suspended in the murk. Things would whisper to me there, tell me things I couldn't understand. I was powerless to stop them. This happened very rarely, but it was still too often for my tastes. I don't know what I said to Dr. McAllister in those times, but there was always a drastic change when I came back to myself. It wasn't always for the better either. Once I came back to myself and felt something wet in my lap. I glanced down, which was difficult because my head was strapped to the headrest, and found that someone had thrown a head into my lap. I flinched away from it as my groggy brain finally clicked it all together, but it was little more than a shudder in my current state. The head had wispy gray hair, a pair of broken glasses hanging across the face from one ear, and a nose full of broken veins from a lifetime of drinking. I didn't recognize it, but as it soaked the pants of my pajamas, I did feel like it was familiar somehow. Dr. McAllister was sitting across from me, looking expectantly at the gift he had literally dropped in my lap, and I looked at it with confusion as I asked why he had done this. You told me to. You said if I meant to truly get over the cruelty and abuse that my father had given me, then I had to destroy the icon of my father within myself. So I did. I told him that I wanted to meet so we could discuss our past and reconcile. He was ecstatic. He hadn't seen me in 20 years, and oh, did we reconcile. I waited for him to turn around, and I bashed his head in with a hammer, choking him to death as he lay twitching on the floor. Then I took the body and disposed of it, cutting the head off so I could show you that I'd followed your instructions. You're so wise, so correct. I am your loyal disciple, always. I started screaming, mindless, gibbering noise, but he just bowed to me, and when the head hit the ground next to him, he didn't even flinch. That was my first inclination that the things I was saying in my sleep might be used in this way, in ways that I had never considered. After that, he started bringing people down to see me. At first, it was his wife, the blonde woman who'd been feeding me. She looked skeptical as she approached, content to keep her husband's secrets, but unsure of joining him in this new experiment. I knew from our talks that he was afraid she would leave him, but enjoyed the financial stability of their marriage. He stuck me with the needle as she sat a few feet away, and when I came to, she was bowing and crying and thanking me for helping her see the truth. My husband was right. You are truly a god. I was wrong to ever doubt you, or him. After that, it was friends and colleagues. They all seemed confused when he introduced them to me, calling me his god of knowledge, and some of them laughed, thinking it was a joke. They would sit and talk to me, listening to my answers, and looking at McAllister as if to ask if this were an elaborate prank. In the end, though, when I came back from the little nap he would subject me to, it was always the same. Their smirks of disbelief or scowls of confusion were replaced with rapturous awe, and they would pledge their undying fealty to me. No matter how many of them I begged to release me, the outcome was always the same. A religion of sorts began to form. Over time, McAllister drew in his cult. It was only a few at first, 5, 10, but it quickly grew into a sizable little flock. The followers began to take care of me, washing and feeding and seeing to my every whim, except the most important. I would ask them to release me, beg them to let me go, but it was always interpreted as a test of some sort. Their God was testing them to see if they were loyal to the here or to the hereafter, and they would thank me for helping them fortify their belief in me as they slid my hands back into the restraints or pushed my head back into the buckles. I yelled at them. I called them idiots. I tried to push them, but the constant use of sedatives and the lack of any regular exercise had made me weak. I wasn't wasting away, but I wasn't getting the exercise I needed to be certain. I could do little to free myself. My bonds always replaced, and after a while I just gave in. The funny thing was that whatever I was telling them while I was under was working. McAllister showed me the money he had made, earned from the stock market and selling property, and the cult began to thrive. What's more, they all claimed to have cast off whatever addictions or mental health problems or childhood traumas had plagued them, and they were addicted now to nothing but serving me. Like McAllister had said, those who tried to leave or to return to their lives reported feeling hopeless and manic unless they could return to my presence and hear my words, whatever they were. That's when things started to get bad. McAllister was truly addicted to my influence, and it led him to overstep. McAllister had been gathering his followers at his home, and while it was large, it was becoming too small to hold all of them. I can't really speculate how many there were, but the basement was standing room only. I sat beneath a small bar that he was standing on, and the sea of bodies was dizzying. Though he was speaking, they all looked at me as if I were speaking through him. So many eyes looking at me. My body still held in the chair I had sat in for God knew how long, was something I never quite got used to. It never made me feel like a deity. It never made me feel powerful to have them worship me. It always made me feel like a pet, my freedom just one open door away. McAllister said they'd be moving to a new place soon, a place that would house them all comfortably. They could all stay there indefinitely, leaving their jobs and lives behind so they could care for their captive god. He didn't say where it was, but he said they would all go this afternoon and prepare for a long journey. They were all so happy, their faces enraptured as he told them about their new home. But I began to feel that this would never end. When he began to bring people to see me, I had hoped that someone would fail to see me as he did and get me out of here. They would take me away from him. They would call the police, and I would be saved from my captivity. That never happened. Whatever power I had held them in sway, and after a while I doubted that I would ever get out of here. I didn't know how long I had been McAllister's captive god, but I knew that no matter how comfortable the life, this had to end. I decided then that if they weren't going to get me out, I would have to do it myself. Strangely, my chance came that very day. They had all left me so they could prepare, and as I sat in the shadowy basement, I realized that my wrist strap was undone. This had never happened before. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. It took all the energy I had to focus enough to get my hand to undo the other strap. And when I bent down to undo my legs, the effort seemed to take years. My mind was like unraveling yarn, and it was hard to focus on any particular task. When the bonds came off my legs, I got shakily to my feet before bending to rub some life into them. They were prickly from the lack of use, and I took shaky steps as I made for the stairs. I got to the top before I was discovered. I peeked through the door and into the barren kitchen beyond. The cupboards were empty, the countertops clean, and I could tell that this room had already been cleaned out for the move. I had just decided to take a step out and make for the back door when someone walked into the kitchen and saw me. They called for McAllister, walking to me as they insisted I return to my chair. I pushed at them, telling them to get away from me, to get out of my way, but as I lunged for the back door, I heard others coming in to stop me. I made it to the backyard, squinting at the sun as it hit my eyes, but I found it fenced with tall wooden boards. I was grabbed by many hands, and when someone slipped a needle into my neck, I looked back to see McAllister instruct them to get me in the car. I came to some time later, and I was laying in an elaborate bed, my hands cuffed to the frame. That began the worst part of my confinement, though it was thankfully the end of it. After that, the drugging became worse. McAllister and his inner circle kept me in a near constant catatonic state. The drugs he used were no longer just injected, and they began to experiment with other substances. The documents that were found later said they received different outcomes when different kinds of drugs were used, and they often sat around and drank or laughed as I came in and out of reality. I was aware of nothing in those times. A ship drifting on a sea of time. I could have been with them for days. I could have spent decades under their control. But to me, time was only islands glimpsed from afar. I didn't see many people in that time, just the 5 or so who were in McAllister's inner circle. But these men always spoke as if they were doing very well. Often there was cigar smoke around my bed, the smell of expensive liquor, and always the low murmur of talk as they waited for me to tell them what else they might do to gain more power. I'd become their oracle, their captive god as opposed to their revered deity, and they threatened to use me up. These are the times I remember the least about, except for the end. I spent a lot of my days in a black stupor, and the more they experimented, the more often I was back in the dark place. When I came back from these trances, I noticed a change in my captors. Gone were the shining eyes of the enraptured. Disappeared were the weeping orbs of the enlightened. They were replaced by the flinty eyes of the zealot, and I was afraid that he might break his promise. He looked angry, but also resolved. Whatever I had told him weighed heavily on him. but I wouldn't understand the burden, not for a while yet. Not until the day it all came to an end. I came to one afternoon to find an intrusive light leaking into my dark chamber. They had always kept me in this persistent dark room, but now the door was open, and something was laying in it. On the floor, there were others, none of them moving, and I was confused by their sudden stillness. Was this something new? Were they sleeping, or were they... I tried to put that thought out of my head. They couldn't be dead, I reminded myself as I shook my chains. If they were all dead, then who would free me so I didn't die here too? I did as you said, came a monotone voice, and I jumped as I realized that one of the slumped forms had only been praying. It was McAllister. He looked wild. His salt and pepper hair was sticking up at odd angles, and his face was splattered with blood. His shirt was soaked in something as it hung on him like a wet sack. He appeared to be praying, but as something clinked in his shaky hands, I saw that he held a gun. I was afraid that he would shoot me too for half a second, but as he put it under his chin, I became even more afraid that he would use it on himself. I have risen as high as I can. Your will dictates that I must shed my vehicle to rise any higher. I shall see you on the other side. His blood made a crimson line across my face as the gun went off. And suddenly, my fears were realized. I was alone. Luckily for me, someone heard the gunshot. I would lay in that bed for 2 days before the FBI came to investigate the compound. Turned out they'd been keeping an eye on McAllister for quite some time, ever since he had started gathering followers at his home. After 2 years in his new compound, they had begun to try to prepare a case against him, before he woke up one morning and decided to put an end to his little flock. With the help of his wife, they had poisoned the morning meal, and McAllister had drawn his inner circle to a meeting before breakfast. That's where he shot them, as they sat listening to my latest ramblings. They had found journals that claimed there were things I had told them, but after interviewing me, I think they decided that he was out of his mind. At least, that's what Agent Maxit led me to believe. We're going to have to hold you as a person of interest, but it honestly sounds like you were an unwilling participant. I'm going to go and get some things in order. Have a seat. We'll make some accommodations for you. After he left, I noticed the recorder sitting on the table. It wasn't running, which I had expected, and when I reached for it, I saw the tape inside had a date on it that I remembered. It was the date of my first session with Dr. McAllister. Couldn't imagine a reason behind the FBI having a tape with that date on it, unless McAllister had recorded it for some reason. I put the recorder back down, trying to stop my curiosity before it could take root. I had never heard what I sounded like in that state that seemed to enrapture the old doctor so much. What had I said to him to make him throw his whole life away in the pursuit of it? I couldn't help myself. I hit play on the recorder and listened as McAllister told me to be calm and began to count down from 10. It wasn't the jagged, often flighty voice I remembered from any time after his session. This was McAllister at his most sane, and as he came to 1, I heard him gasp and ask what I was doing. From the recording, I heard a slightly deeper version of my own voice, and it filled me with dread. Agent Maxit has been listening to the tapes. He's becoming as unstable as the good doctor. If you don't escape now, I fear that he'll have you just like McAllister did. You'll have to be quick, and you'll have to be smart. But if you mean to be free, you need to find a way out of here. Good luck.
And just like that, our stories are at an end for another day. But don't worry, We'll be back tomorrow with more cozy horror for you to enjoy. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.